Help answer that question is Inimai Chettiar. She is Justice Program Director at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School. And she's also the editor of the book Solutions, American Leaders Speak Out on Criminal Justice. Christine Leonard is Executive Director of the Coalition for Public Safety. And Asha Bandele is an author and director of the Drug Policy Alliance Grants Program. We're also joined by Marc Levin, who is Policy Director with Right on Crime. Dylan Rodriguez joins us. He's the professor and chairman of the Ethnic Studies Department at the University of California, Riverside. Everyone, welcome to HuffPost Live. Asha, I'm going to start with you. You work very squarely in the policy domain. What's your take on what Hillary Clinton has said about mass incarceration?
You know, I have to say, of course, I'm never going to disagree with anybody who says that we have to revisit this vulgar sort of way we've engaged the criminal justice system. But I was really surprised by the lack of substance that she offered yesterday. And she mentioned in the clip you showed real reforms, but didn't offer any. And what you're talking about is, as we saw in the Times the other day, 1.5 million Black men missing from communities. I mean, I would have really liked to have heard. She's had plenty of time to think about this. This isn't new issues, to be sure, but how she intends to sort of do the same sort of New Deal that Roosevelt did post the Great Depression, right, where he looked at the 3 R's. We have some R's that we need to look at, which is restore the basic citizenship to people who've been incarcerated, repair the communities that have been so harmed, tax bases have been lost, people have been economically displaced and entirely whole communities by the way mass incarceration has impacted the system, and then really revolutionize the system. And I know that a lot of people find that word scary, but when I look at the policing practices and you see every 28 hours a Black man killed, it's time to really look at this kind of policy that we have around policing that started out as slave patrols. And as far as Black communities are concerned, I don't think ever got too far away from that. And I don't want to take up everybody's time here, but I mean, I have some real suggestions about some policies that we could begin to upend right now that would go a long way toward restoring balance in the criminal justice system, beginning with dismantling the war on drugs. And there's some specific things around that I'd like to suggest later in the program.
Absolutely, and we'll definitely get there. Inimai, let me bring you into the conversation here. Hillary Clinton laid out some policy specifics. She talked, or not specifics perhaps, but she talked about increasing mental health care resources. She talked about finding drug treatment. These are things that many people in the drug policy reform community and people in the mass incarceration or anti-prison movement or prison abolition movements have all asked for a very long time as ways of reimagining the role of the prison. Have we turned a corner here, or is this a Clinton moment where she's being opportunistic politically and not ready to put any teeth to this?
So I think that we have turned a moment. It's not just the Clintons talking about this. We also have presidential candidates varying from Chris Christie to Scott Walker to Rand Paul that you mentioned, actually providing very concrete reforms. And in Secretary Clinton's speech, I actually heard a couple of very specific policy proposals that I think all of us would be very happy with. One, which is ending incarceration for people convicted of low-level offenses. And so I think that can go a long way toward reducing our prison population. Second, I think she really made a very important point about mental health and drug treatment, and that's something that everyone on the left and the right are coming to agree on. The third thing also is that she actually did talk about a new way of policing and a shift away from over-enforcement and increasing drug arrests. And so I think those three things actually go a long way towards reducing mass incarceration.
Marc Levin, what say you? Marc, I think Marc's audio. Oh, there we go. We lost your audio for a second. Go ahead.
Sorry about that. Yes, well, we started Right on Crime in 2010, really to explain why a lot of criminal justice reforms fit very well into conservative principles of limited government, keeping families together, redemption, which is something every major religious tradition proclaims, and also making sure that we're not too tough on taxpayers. And I think that it's super encouraging that you have people like Ted Cruz, Rand Paul, and then you also have the states that have done major reforms, like Georgia, where Black incarceration has gone down 20% as a result of some consensus reform packages that have included reducing sentences on low-level drug offenders and expanding alternative to incarceration that have gone through over the last few years. So I think it's really a tremendous moment for this issue. And I think that what's clear is there's ways to both reduce incarceration and reduce crime at the same time. And that's why you're seeing huge numbers of the American public, 70, 80% at least, on both sides of the aisle saying, let's move forward on this.
Marc, is there any danger, though, in the right's interest in this issue being market-driven? We saw everything from the Koch brothers to Ted Cruz and, as you mentioned, Rand Paul, sort of talking about the burdens of taxpayers, the sort of economic burden that it places on the nation. Is there a challenge when that's the approach coming from the right, and while the left is making a slightly more ethical or moral appeal to why mass incarceration is wrong? Is there a moment where those interests intersect for sure, but are there also moments of divergence where we're going to have to make tough choices, and if so, what are they?
Well, it's a good question. I would point out that we've taken up issues like solitary confinement. We have thousands of people in prison 23 hours a day with no stimulation. And of course, we would argue that occasionally there is a need if someone commits a violent act, but against another inmate, for example, or a staff. But most of the people in solitary confinement, they may be there just because they're a suspected gang member or because they violated pretty minor disciplinary rules in prison, like curfews or whatever. So, the main problem is there's no way in a lot of systems for people to get out of solitary confinement. So now, of course, actually, solitary confinement does cost more than being in the general population of a prison. But the main reason that we're engaged on that is that it's a moral issue. After all, what greater restriction on liberty can you imagine? Now, I do think, those of us on the right would argue that occasionally people's liberties have to be restricted because they're a danger to society. But I think too often we just punish for the sake of punishment because we're mad at people and not because we're afraid of them. And so I think there is a lot of convergence. Certainly there are differences. I think that it's really important that people are held accountable, that we make sure victims get restitution when things are stolen from them. And I would hope everyone can agree with that. And that, obviously, if there's a program like a drug court or treatment, if someone doesn't show up, there have to be some consequences to that. But it can be, as we've seen with the Hawaii Hope Court, going to jail for the weekend rather than, saying you have to go to prison for a year or be revoked from probation for something that's a technical, a trivial violation. And so the other thing you have to realize is people do have relapses when they're on drugs. It is an addiction for a reason. So I think there's a way to have both a carrot and a stick, and I hope people across the aisle can agree that that's the right approach.
Christine, let me talk to you because you're with the Coalition for Public Safety, and that's partially funded by the Koch brothers. There is some legitimate skepticism from some of us, myself included, about what it means for them to be in the mass incarceration game, even in the context of trying to end it.
Sure. And I think the conversation continues to evolve. I should just acknowledge that, one of the reasons I think that this particular coalition is really unprecedented is that Koch Industries is one of the funders, but they're also joined by Laura and John Arnold, as well as the Ford Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation. All three of those other partners have been doing different kinds of work in this space for a long time. And I'm thrilled that Marc Levin and Right on Crime are one of our core partners in this effort, along with 6 other groups, the ACLU, Americans for Tax Reform, Center for American Progress, Faith and Freedom Coalition, Freedom Works, and the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights. I will just admit, even if you had asked me a couple of years ago if you would get such a divergent range of organizations to come together on this issue, I never would have expected it. I think that when there was a lot of early right-left conversations around some of these issues, it was focused on white-collar criminal conduct, but at the same time, there are other leaders out there like Pat Nolan, who's part of Right on Crime, who has been talking for years about the need for good prison conditions, around the need for safety, both for the people serving time as well as the officers that work there, from a values perspective. So I think we are at a turning point, as Inimai said, that there's both an agreement across ideological spectrum, but also there's agreement about the solutions.
And well, we'll come back to that because I'm not sure there's entire agreement across the board, as much as all 4 of us who have spoken so far would like to think. Dylan, let me bring you in because I think this is another piece of the equation. One of the things that's happened in the last 2 weeks is that there's been an enhanced public conversation about this idea of mass incarceration, a term that I know you find troublesome in and of itself. But before we get there, talk to me about what it means to connect the Baltimore uprisings to mass incarceration? Because for some, it's a very neat connection. For others, it's a little more messy.
Well, number one, I don't think we actually all agree on what the problem is. We keep using the phrase mass incarceration, and I think when Hillary Clinton and her right-wing colleagues start to use this phrase so effortlessly, it's time for us to start asking some serious questions as to whether it actually means anything. I find the phrase entirely useless. I can talk about that in a minute, but what I will say is that the thing that the uprisings in Baltimore are beginning to bring to the foreground is how it is that all this discourse about reform of the criminal justice system is actually reaffirming another racial and gender discourse about who belongs in prison. So on the one hand, you see this so-called ideological spectrum across the conservative left to the conservative right agreeing on the need for reform. On the other hand, this entire consensus still agrees that you need to lock up black and brown thugs. And that's the fundamental problem. The fundamental problem is that you can do all the reform you want to the extent that you don't actually have a real conversation about the forces of policing and criminalization as historical forces that have mounted over the last 40 years and intensified to the point where in some places in this country, it's like undeclared martial law. That's what we need to understand. And that's what the people in Baltimore are saying. It's what people on hunger strike in Georgia and California were saying. It's what people all over the country have been saying. We need to start listening to that discourse, not just what Hillary Clinton and Rand Paul are saying. That's where I stand.
Jump on in, please.
Yeah, I really thank you, Professor Rodriguez, for what you said, because I didn't fundamentally hear incredible things being said by Hillary Clinton. She wasn't, and even here, when we've talked today, we're not talking about removing, you say you can punish them, but lightly. Even if you just have something where you have drug courts, which is what she talked about, for example, in the speech. You're still there in Mississippi. There's a whole bunch of people where, like in Jackson, you have decriminalized use of marijuana, but people still going to jail because they can't pay the fines associated with them, which has its foundation in the Black Code. So I appreciate what Professor Rodriguez was saying, because you're talking about the fundamental mass criminalization of people. And until we start really pulling apart these issues, and you still have the criminal justice system involved in far too much of our lives, you're not going to make any fundamental change.
And the word people, Dylan, the word people here also seems to be somewhat fuzzy, right? I mean, we keep saying the criminalization of people, but even in the example Asha just gave, where people are getting arrested for nonviolent drug offenses and then going to jail ultimately because they can't afford to pay it, it seems like these are racial and class categories that are going unnamed and unidentified. And it seems to me that that might be part of what you're talking about when you say mass incarceration itself is not an accurate term.
Mass incarceration has become a useless term, an empty term. It's not mass incarceration. Until you have 70% of the people incarcerated white, it's not mass incarceration. It's selective, it's targeted, it's structured in race, class, gender, and so forth. It is not mass incarceration. We got to stop saying that. I don't know what phrase to use yet, but we need to open up a discussion as to how that phrase is actually inaccurate, and it obscures our politics, it obscures our policy, and it creates false consensus when there really ought not be any. And that's what these uprisings all over the country are telling us.
Well,
Marc Levin.
It's racialized.
Oh, please go ahead. No, jump on in.
I want to push back a little bit on, what's been going on in Baltimore, in the sense that I do think that certainly things like looting don't help move the ball. If anything, they kind of create
talking about the white-collar looters? Let's talk about the white-collar looters and hold them accountable.
Talk about asset forfeiture.
Hold on. One thing at a time. 1 second at a time. Asha, hold on 1 second, because I want Marc to finish his point. You all are welcome to disagree. I'm probably inclined to myself, but I want Marc to articulate his point, and I'd like to get some other people to jump in so that we can hear what he says. Go ahead.
Sure. And look, I mean, most people out there are not causing disruption, and there's a great history of civil disobedience. I'm just talking about violating the law. Two wrongs doesn't make a right, and destroying property, whether it's in Ferguson or Baltimore, that isn't going to advance anything. It's just going to promote a backlash. Now, I will say on the issue of, for example, people that can't pay fines for things like traffic violations and get warrants and such, that's a huge problem. In Ferguson, there was 3.6 warrants per household, and why not create a system where people could do community service to get these minor traffic and other misdemeanor warrants disposed of? Because you have all these people with warrants, you're not going to have them reporting violent crime and be witnesses. They're going to be afraid to come forward. So we have to create police partnerships with the community. There's great ideas like David Kennedy's Collins, this National Partnership for Safe Communities that he's been doing with really getting the community and the police on the same page. And it's not that these communities don't need policing. They may need as much or not more policing, but a different kind of policing that really works with the community. And so So, obviously, if you look in places like New York City, certain things like CompStat and data-driven policing had a huge impact on deterring street crime, which contributed to Rikers Island shrinking, tens of thousands of fewer people from New York City and the state prison system. So better policing can go hand in hand with reducing incarceration. But it's got to be in partnership with the community.
Sounds like
Christine, let me bring Christine in, and let me go to Christine. I promise I'll bring Dylan and Asha back in. I just want to make sure that we lay out the point first.
Can I get in also?
Absolutely, Inimai. Christine, there is an argument here that race and gender are central parts of this conversation, and that the very language of mass incarceration itself suggests somehow that there's some demographic equity in who's getting locked up, as if the nation just locks up its citizens. And the counter argument here is that the nation doesn't lock up its citizens. It locks up black and brown citizens. It locks up poor citizens. It locks up very particular citizens. And so we're creating, to use Dylan's language, a kind of false consensus around what mass incarceration is, which makes it difficult to fix the problem.
Well, I agree in the sense that there's a need to focus on vulnerable populations across the board. And where I would just suggest that we will have a better chance around consensus solutions is when we're starting with the research and the facts that we know now. I mean, one of the things that Hillary Clinton highlighted in her remarks, which I don't think is known broadly among the American public, while it may be very closely held by a lot of us in the field, is that our prisons and jails are now mental health institutions. And, thinking about that cycle that occurs in terms of both people struggling with mental illness as well as people that are struggling with substance abuse addiction, and how they end up caught up in these cycles, as well as people from disadvantaged communities. And so I would just highlight on a positive note that the Senate Judiciary Committee today moved forward in a bipartisan manner on a legislation that would provide more resources to law enforcement to do crisis intervention training. And this gets to the heart of the issue, right? If there's someone who's in the middle of a psychiatric episode or struggling with addiction who has not engaged in any criminal activity and they really need health care and support, that, if there's ways to divert those people from the criminal justice system, that's where it begins. And I think that's where, too, as much as we need legislative reforms, there's a lot of prosecutorial discretion and policing discretion that can happen at that first point of contact with the justice system that could have a tremendous impact on some of these communities where there have been very disparate impacts in terms of arrests and prosecutions.
Inimai, there is a conversation being had right now, both in this segment but also more broadly, about these reform strategies, whether it's suspended sentences, community-based dispute resolution, whether it's drug treatment. All of these things combined with this conversation about how police engage communities, which suggests that the system itself is reformable. Right? Mass incarceration reform, prison reform, all of these things suggest that there is a system that is broken but can be rebuilt and repaired. Given all of the sort of historical patterns that we've seen, given all of the kind of entrenched structural challenges that we see with regard to mass incarceration, is this a fixable system, or do we have to begin to think that maybe the system itself is broken, that maybe prison reform as such is an inherent problem and contradiction?
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem is quite large, but I do think that there are concrete solutions. Just to start with a few. So one, I think we should eliminate prison when not needed. And I think that concept, states have increased discretion for who goes to prison and who doesn't, but I think that it should be wholesale eliminated for certain categories of crimes. The second thing I think we should do is shorten sentences across the board. So our sentence lengths, the maximums and the minimums, are completely out of whack in terms of crimes committed. The third thing is that there are a host of perverse financial incentives that not only apply to private prisons, but also to public agencies as well, that are actually helping incentivize more arrests, more convictions, more prosecutions, more imprisonment. And reversing those perverse financial incentives could also be quite strong. So yeah, I think that there is a way for us to turn the corner on this.
Dylan, you've been waiting patiently to respond to, I'm sure, a few things you've heard now. Please go ahead.
Well, I mean, here's the thing, is that we need to understand what prison is, and scholars and academics and activists and people locked up and administrators have been saying it for a long time. Prison is a reform. From the very beginning, prison was a reform. It was meant to reform wayward white male citizens. The problem with prisons became when it became the site of first resort to incarcerate and essentially socially neutralize people who had been allegedly emancipated from the institution of chattel slavery. It's at that point that it then turned into a fundamentally racial, a chattel institution, an extension of the slave institution. And you still see that logic tied into every facet of criminalization and policing now. So here's the thing. Prison in and of itself is not our only problem. The problem is criminalization and policing, not police brutality, policing. Most of what is going on in Baltimore that people are in revolt about is not necessarily tied to Freddie Gray. It's tied into everything that preceded and postscripts Freddie Gray. The normal everyday operations of policing are the problem, not just one man's spine being severed. That's what we need to understand. And if we take that seriously, I think our whole language has to change. We can't even use the term police brutality anymore. We got to use the term policing.
If I can just get in here.
One second, Asha. I want to get clarity on Dylan's point, and then please follow up. Dylan, people are going to hear what you just said and say you're saying it almost sounds as if you're saying we just shouldn't have police.
What I'm saying is that what we need is healthy communities. We need forms of infrastructure that actually nourish people, that prevent and intercede on and preempt interpersonal violence as well as structural violence. And you know what? With all due respect, if we're going to talk about accountability, it's a word I heard earlier. I love when people bring that word up, because if you want to talk about criminal accountability, the moment we start talking about criminal accountability for the people who have ruined thousands and thousands of last decade and a half, right, from the owning class to the white collar, then we can actually start to have a real conversation. You know, at that point, suddenly I think you're going to see this consensus start to break down into one that becomes more, that sounds more and more like abolition. It's people that don't want the Koch brothers going to prison. They don't want George W. going to prison. Right. So you want to talk about accountability, let's talk about accountability.
Well, yeah, I would really push back on that. I mean, I think we have to be consistent when we're talking about, for example, one of the issues we've worked on is criminal intent. And so that is that traditionally, to be convicted of a crime, you have to have both a bad act and an intent to harm someone, an intent to violate the law. And so, for example, in Florida, the drug laws said that if you have drugs on possession, then even if you didn't realize it. So, for example, if you rented a car at Hertz rental car, and unbeknownst to you, there were drugs in where the spare tire is supposed to be under the trunk, you are automatically guilty if you're pulled over. And that's the same issue that comes up with kids in school with zero tolerance who didn't realize they had a vaporizer for asthma in their pocket. Okay, but it's also the same issue that comes up when you're talking about business people who have to deal with over 4,500 federal criminal laws, that they didn't realize that it was a federal crime to bring in seafood from Central America that was a slightly larger or smaller than the requirements. Or another man who went to federal prison for bringing in orchids that didn't have the right paperwork under federal law. So I would argue that there is a commonality, whether you're talking about white collar or street crimes, that we've eroded criminal intent, we've given prosecutors too much power, and we have to get back to the fundamentals of criminal law. And I believe we have to decriminalize certain things that shouldn't be crimes to begin with. In Texas, we've got 2,000 criminal laws. I counted 3,500 in Arizona, over 4,500 at the federal level. So, and I agree with everything Inimai said about making sentences fit the crime. And I also believe that as far as policing is concerned, of course we need police, but we do need the right kind of policing. I think that, as to the racial aspects, I would also say, even if you just look at white incarceration in the U.S., it's far above Western Europe and other, democracies. So I would say that it isn't simply a racial problem, but there's certainly a racial dimensions to the problem.
Asha, I'll give you the last word.
I'm sort of stunned to just hear that last piece. Statistically, there's no way that you can look at this and not say that it's not a racial problem. And in New York State, you're talking about 92% of Black people are in prison for drug crimes when drugs are used and sold at the same rates across the races. So to even say that is insane. It makes me think of what my friend Professor Earl Henderson often says, is that white supremacy doesn't only tell you what to think, it tells you how to think. And so to the point that Dylan was making earlier, when we're talking, just even bring up the question of looting and to bring that up in the absence of talking about what's truly looted these communities, right? You're talking about civil asset forfeiture that's impoverished whole communities. You want to talk about thugs, talk about people who walk into houses and kill children with flash grenades. That happens all over this country. Or grandmothers, oops, we had the wrong house, and no one pays a penalty for that. And yet you're going to focus on somebody who threw a brick, who was snatched off a school bus trying to go home, because that's what happened in Baltimore. And so the idea that we're even talking about folks in these most narrow terms still takes us away from the fundamental contradiction of what is happening in the streets, and that we even begin with policing as if policing should be the last thing we need to get to. Because it would be imagining sort of talking about this in apartheid South Africa, as if we were blaming anything that was happening in Soweto or some of the other townships, when everything else that was going on to upend people's lives, 35% unemployment, people being completely displaced and dispossessed and separated from their families. It's the same thing that you see in Black communities here, where Freddie Gray lived, 51% of the people are unemployed. That's unacceptable. And so there's so many other things we have to talk to. So when we begin with policing as a resolution to the problems on the ground, we begin from a faulty place. We're beginning with the wrong answer to the wrong question.
Well, I just said that there are racial dimensions to the problem, but it's
Marc,
not simply a racial problem. But I agree we need to end civil asset forfeiture, and we also need to stop these no-knock warrantless raids unless you're looking for a murder or something.
We need to call them thugs.
For a small amount of drugs.
Call them thugs, and not 15 and 16-year-old kids.
All right, well, let's pause.